Hello! We have one longer story today, split across two updates that come from fHOA. You can fill in the blank, I'm sure, of a real-life, legit HOA Karen with a story unfolding in real time. She's corrupt as heck, the rules for thee but not for me type, and goes about taking community resources away with lies just because something is unsightly. And if you're one of those, it's fake people, well, may I suggest you stretch that suspension of disbelief a bit more often because this one has receipts, including a newspaper article detailing most of what is written. People like this do exist, but in dark times like this, heroes will rise. Story 1. I live in a small HOA of 220 single-family homes in northwest Colorado Springs, not far from the USAFA, and our board is fully off the rails. At our annual meeting last October, the board was content to let the association manager, hired via a private company, lead the meeting, which quickly devolved into a disaster. She was presenting grossly overinflated charges to the community for supposedly state-mandated administrative tasks that aren't actually required of our community. That night, the board manipulated the ballots and proxies cast at the meeting and quite literally stole the election. They also tried to use these ballots to cast votes to double the association's annual dues. They're running completely unchecked. They've allowed and conducted no audits for years, required in our governing documents. Those are only for them to hold over us, not the other way around. Anyway, late last year, the city mailed out postcards about a small daycare one of our neighbors was running out of their home. The HOA quite literally did not know it existed, both due to their own incompetence and due to the courteous nature with which the owner operates the childcare. However, once the city sent notices, these people went on a full-blown attack that continues to this day. They started sending mass emails to the community, telling them it was urgent to send letters of opposition to the city. They didn't ask us how we felt, they just tried to get people as worked up in opposition as possible. Colorado has a law that says HOAs can't prohibit childcare homes. Full stop. And the city, which as of today requires a permit for someone running a childcare out of their home, updated the city's Unified Development Code to now just grant this use by right. In other words, she will have the right to do this, period, without even needing a permit once that new ordinance kicks in on June 5th. The board knows this, and yet they have spent the last 6 months and our HOA dollars making this poor woman's life utter hell. One board member has become so obsessed she literally sat outside the house in her car and followed these families out of the neighborhood to see where they live. She insists this is just her doing her due diligence. She doesn't seem to think there's anything wrong with this. She is also openly telling people that she is, in my opinion, essentially stalking children. So the board, of course, appeals the permit for this childcare at a city planning commission meeting, pointing to all the letters they told their friends and neighbors to send. The city correctly denies their request and issues the permit. Then, the board appeals the planning commission's decision to the city council. The city council correctly denies that appeal and upholds the permit. And even after all of this, despite state law, despite city ordinances, and even after the city denied their appeals twice, the HOA is now issuing covenant violations for covenants void under state law. And then, icing on the cake, today they sent an email blast out to the entire community naming those of us who spoke at City Council in support of the childcare, thus basically putting targets on our back and essentially deputizing the neighbors, charging them with the task of monitoring the childcare. This poor woman now is looking at paying hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in legal fees to stop their harassment and fight for her livelihood, for something she has every right to be doing. We live in a childcare desert, and our community needs this service. I can never have children of my own, and yet even I know this childcare is crucial to the health of our neighborhood. We're also anchored by an elementary school. This is not an issue of children being out of place here, or of the resulting noise or traffic. And the HOA is content to burn my annual dues on this harassment campaign. It's honestly disgusting. They're a bunch of 60-plus NIMBYs, or not in my backyard, who have already raised their families, and everyone else is just out of luck, apparently. So Reddit, I'm asking for your help. Please send all your wisdom, your suggestions, your delightful schemes for malicious compliance. 6 whole months stand between us and the next annual meeting, where they'll probably just manipulate the ballots again anyway. And this trash cannot continue unchecked for that long. In the comments, Ace Joe said, she followed these families out of the neighborhood to see where they live. I'm shocked that this problem didn't take care of itself. If I notice someone following me to work or home, there is a good chance for them to be reported to the police for stalking. Or worse, for them, an altercation. Sweet Robna asked, the only realistic options are to sell your home or get together with your neighbors and recall the board. Are your neighbors content with what the board does now? OP replied, I think a lot of them just don't realize what is happening, or they trust the board to do the right thing. There are young families moving in who are busy with their lives, but a lot of the homes are still occupied by their original owners going back to the 1970s. I don't want to paint them all with a broad brush, but they're older people, former military and conservative, who have already raised their families, maybe aren't eager to see change. Our next-door neighbor, for example, is nearly 90, has needed our help in the past to figure out how to use and fix her phone, and doesn't realize she has the internet. She's incredibly sweet, but presumably doesn't know about this email the board sent either. A lot of the older crowd seems to think this is just a disagreement, or even that we're airing dirty laundry publicly when it should be addressed privately. I grew up here. I was raised in part by my grandparents, so I feel like I know this generation well-ish. I'm afraid their instinct is more likely to lean in support of the board members. But I'll be knocking on all their doors regardless. The people my age, on the other hand, are pissed. We have more and more of them on our side every day. It helps that the board member issuing covenant violations is completely unhinged. She keeps making enemies for the smallest and pettiest of violations, and we sweep them right up. Is this an example of an older generation trying to keep the youngins out with all their loud parties and hooliganism? Those toddlers just cause such a ruckus. In my experience, older generations are typically pleased to see the little ones growing up around them. Keeps them feeling young. I've not heard of a reaction that entails PI-level surveillance, but then again, OP did say she's unhinged. And if some of the other members are military vets, I can see why OP would be worried that they'd appreciate that level of due diligence. Because apparently that's what we're calling stalking toddlers these days. Goodness. Our second story is the update, and oh boy did OP deliver. Karen is even more of a Karen than you could ever have imagined, and it all comes out in the end. Story 2. The other day I shared a story about our rogue HOA board, and holy potatoes do I have updates for you. We went scorched earth on Nextdoor. I hate everything about that site, but it's a tool available to us, and connected with quite a few neighbors who are angry as well. One of them was telling me about the harassment they've had to deal with. I mentioned it's likely because the Covenant's director, the tormentor of the neighborhood, lives on her street. That was news to her, so she looked up the address, and it turns out the HOA Banshee doesn't own a house in our neighborhood. That's a requirement for being a board member. The house is still in the name of her deceased mother-in-law, who has been dead since freaking 2016. After double and triple checking property records, I immediately called the president of the board to tell him, and I was disappointed to find it wasn't news to him. It apparently came up back when she and another woman who had also inherited her home were appointed, not elected, to the board. The association manager at the time caught it, and they both assured her it was just a paperwork thing and that it was going to be addressed. No one followed up, because of course they didn't, and everyone assumed it was done. The president of the board then goes on to tell me that he thinks they probably haven't updated it for tax reasons. So, not only is this woman on the board when she knows she cannot be, but there are implications that she and her husband are possibly committing tax fraud. It is just so typical of people like this. Like, of course this woman would be all, rules for thee and not for me. Of course she would be harassing people about governing documents that she herself is knowingly violating. She has spent the last 6 months claiming one of our neighbors is violating various HOA, city, and state rules for running a home childcare, which is a lie. Our neighbor is fully licensed and permitted and in good standing with all the regulatory agencies involved, all while actually being the one violating the rules and law herself. And if the HOA had followed up on this issue, she wouldn't have been on the board and all of her harassment of the owner of the childcare could have been prevented. That's the saddest and most frustrating part. Anyway, the president of the board knows I'm not letting this go. Also, that I will absolutely be holding him accountable to do the right thing. And he told me yesterday he'll be telling her she can no longer serve on the board. It's the most satisfying example of the informal definition of karma I've ever seen. By needlessly harassing her neighbors and community, she has basically rained hell down on herself. Meanwhile, I seem to have the ear of the president of the board, who I suspect can sense the tides are changing, and now wisely has been open to the idea of appointing new, fresh perspectives to the board and working together to implement change for the better. I personally never would have gone to battle for all of this had the existing board members not behaved how they did. And all I could think of is Olenna Tyrell's last scene in Game of Thrones. I want her to know it was me. Edit. We've been told by the president of the board that the Banshee will be relieved from her position on April 26. In the comments, Fool said, "Don't forget to report them to IRS so they can investigate the potential tax fraud." Mystic Storm added, "Report them to the city and county tax department as they're the ones who do assessments and collect property taxes. This isn't an IRS issue yet." Mr. Godot said, "You're not done yet, mate. Report her to the relevant tax authorities. Life affords few opportunities like this. Don't just stab her, twist the knife." Sarah Phillip added, "I'd boot the president as well, guilty by association or stupidity. He went along and did nothing." Typical is right. There is nothing worse than a big fat hippopotamus of a hypocrite. But thankfully for OP, Karen failed to do her own due diligence on this one. She really should have gotten to that paperwork, because there is no way that this can end well for her. She's going to be tossed from her HOA throne and get the guillotine from the taxman. And that's it for today. Until next time, shine bright, Starlight. If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.